Remember that period during the lockdown when you could hear birdsong even in the busiest of cities? During the pandemic, we rediscovered our neighbourhoods and the simple pleasure of staying local. Add to this the fact that many businesses were forced to experiment with working from home, and we inevitably got a taste of the sort of life that might be expected in a 15-minute city.
What is a 15-minute city?
To improve livability, the Victorian government is working to create a city of 20-minute neighbourhoods.
C'est la demande qui m'a été faite autour de la ville de proximité, la ville du quart d'heure.
Call it a 20-minute neighbourhood, a compact neighbourhood, or a 15-minute city. The principles are the same. Everything you could need is a short walk or cycle from home. You can pick up a prescription from the pharmacy on your walk to get a coffee before cutting through the park and dropping your child off at school. Of course, there are many neighbourhoods in cities across the world where these idyllic scenes are already a reality. But the concept of the 15-minute city, coined by urbanist Professor Carlos Moreno, envisions that every resident, regardless of class, age and race, enjoys this quality of life. It's a simple concept that's become a bit of a controversial topic and even prompted outrage from certain political commentators, claiming that the model would be an attack on civil liberties. But from an urban planning perspective, the principles it preaches make sense, even though putting it into practice is, of course, a different matter. In this episode of Common Ground, we're in Paris and the US, taking a look at the ambitious towns and cities adopting the 15-minute city principles. We talk to urbanists, planners, and city managers about the importance of walkability for the health of ourselves and our planet. Plus, we discuss how inclusivity and affordability are really at the heart of making the model work. Stay with us. This is a podcast by TOPOSOPHY. For more than a decade, TOPOSOPHY has been inspiring and informing its clients on how to transform places, whether they're neighbourhoods, cities, regions, or whole countries. The TOPOSOPHY team works with international organisations, multinational brands, and government agencies around the world, leading them every step of the way to find placemaking and marketing solutions that are built to last. As constantly curious people, the team loves to collect game-changing ideas that are transforming other sectors and draw valuable lessons for the future of places. This podcast series, curated by the TOPOSOPHY team, is just one example of how these valuable ideas are brought to life.
If we wanted to put it in a nutshell, we could say that we have accepted the unacceptable. In the developed countries, the situation with indignities, for example, social housing, the long commute, and the most important point, we don't have useful time.
That's Professor Carlos Moreno, the architect of the 15-minute city model. He wants us to reclaim the valuable time in our days, which is often wasted on transit. Now, the concept lends itself from ideas already put forward throughout the 20th century, from Jane Jacobs in the 60s to New Urbanism in the 80s. Experiments with the model are happening worldwide, from Melbourne to Portland and Seoul to Bogota. It's even been promoted by C40, a network of nearly 100 cities, as a blueprint for a green and just recovery from the pandemic.
One typical day, when you have this possibility for living in proximities with a lot of services, with pedestrian areas, with bikeable lanes, is in fact to have more useful time for taking breakfast with his family, for going to the school with kids on foot, to have the possibility for accessing to the sport activities in proximity, and to have more time with my family after working.
The French capital is perhaps the city that's best made a point of moving towards this 15-minute city model. In fact, Paris is where Moreno, along with Mayor Anne Hidalgo, is putting forward some truly revolutionary policies to bring about what some are dubbing the post-automobile age and what the French are calling ville du carter.
The city of Paris is a pioneer city. The city of Paris is a city totally dedicated for pedestrian, protected by lanes. We have today more than 1,000 kilometers for biking safety. We have this urban policy for ban diesel cars.
An Arab study in 2021 concluded that walkability is the first step towards a 15-minute city. This can range from repainting the roads to include cycle lanes or even banning cars altogether. The stats in Paris are impressive. It's seen a drop in car use of 45% since the 90s, while the use of public transport has jumped up by a third, and cyclists on the roads have shot up tenfold. Part of Hidalgo's plan to further this progress will see 60,000 parking spots being scrapped in an effort to give every street in the city space for a bicycle lane.
When you have decided to transform the 12 iconic squares in Paris, instead of to have the roundabout, we have transformed into a square for people.
Perhaps the biggest statement of intent is the transformation of the Champs-Élysées, the iconic avenue inspiring songs, art and poetry, known for its 8 lanes of traffic and the neoclassical Arc de Triomphe at its edge. Moreno and Hidalgo are radically reimagining the use of the thoroughfare by cutting the lanes usable by cars in half and dedicating the rest to pedestrian routes and a garden. Although internationally Paris is regarded as a shining example of implementing the model, in the capital itself, the plans aren't being well received. After all, the changes made to the Champs-Élysées won't exactly help the most underserved in Parisian society. And for those who are confined to the outskirts of the city, thanks to a wildly expensive housing market, the idea of restricting car use is a little concerning. And in a city as affluent as Paris, it's inevitably easier to allocate a good amount of funds to transport infrastructure. But starting to create a more pedestrian-friendly city doesn't always require such a monumental amount of spending.
I love cars. I grew up with subscriptions to Road and Track and Car and Driver magazine. I've always owned the sportiest car I could afford. It took me a long time to realize that this embrace of the automobile is what has really ruined the American landscape, really damaged the quality of our lives and our physical bodies in dramatic ways, tremendously exacerbated inequity, and punished those with the least means in our society.
That's Jeff Speck, speaking to us from Massachusetts in the US. He's an urban planner and author of the best-selling planning book of the past decade, Walkable City. He's dedicated his entire career to solving cities' planning problems, fighting the US's obsession with urban sprawl and spreading the good word of walkability throughout the planning community. He spoke to us about making walkability happen.
You have 2 choices. You can slow down cars or remove them, honestly, that's one side, or separate the pedestrians and the cyclists from them. So those 2 strategies are what we use the most. So this is how I spend most of my time. And I go from city to city around the US and around the world. And I usually start with a lecture. And I have a slide in that lecture, which is actually it's a doctored image of a Red Stripe beer bottle, and it says restripe. And I say, don't rebuild, restripe. Because you can restripe a whole downtown for the cost of rebuilding just a few streets. And I've done project after project. I've done a number of rebuilding projects too, which seem to generate so much, economic growth that the rebuilding made sense anyway. But most of the projects I do are simple restriping, where we don't move the curbs, we don't rebuild anything. We put down a new top coat, and then we look from curb to curb. Oh, it's 10 meters, what can we fit in here? Oh, it's 15 meters, what can we fit in here? In Oklahoma City, I was able to reduce the volume of driving lanes by 30%. Removed 30% of the lanes for cars. So we reallocate street space. We make the lanes narrower. And of course, we put in bike lanes. We put in bike lanes that are buffered. We put in bike lanes that are protected. And often we use the parked cars to protect the bikes. So you don't even have to do any construction to do that. It's just paint.
So by restriping rather than rebuilding, cities and towns can get the wheels spinning on creating more walkable places. What's more, if cities are in a position to invest, the return, as Jeff mentions, often creates a positive economic impact. Walkable downtowns make up just under 2% of the US's total metropolitan area, but they're responsible for a whopping 20% of its GDP, and that market share continues to grow.
So, the percentage of the homes in the US, and in much of Europe too, I would argue, that are actually in walkable places is way, way below the number of people that want to enjoy that quality of life. So if you do all the things that make a place walkable, bikeable, transit served, you're going to have a market advantage when it comes to attracting talent. Then on the other hand of that, the other side of that coin is the incredible cost, the burden that car ownership places on our citizens. In America, we're paying $10,000 a year on average to own a car. That's a lot of money. If you pay $1 to drive in the US, your society is probably paying about $10 more to support your driving through the cost of highways, through the cost of policing and ambulances and car crashes.
And when it comes to investing in cycling infrastructure, Jeff makes a strong point.
So, for example, in Portland, they spent $60 million over 25 years or so creating that bike network that distinguishes Portland from most American cities. That was half the price that they rebuilt, the one highway Cloverleaf that they rebuilt next to downtown.
A citywide cycling network built for half the price of a highway improvement sounds like a pretty good deal. What's more, every $200 invested in highways releases 1 metric ton of carbon emissions, while investing the same amount of money in cycling infrastructure removes a metric ton of carbon from the atmosphere. All these facts add up, but residents' mentality is of course also crucial. How can you be sure that even if the changes are made, people will actually make the switch from car to bike?
The second thing is to say, not only is it build it and they will come, but that you won't know. You really don't know your potential. I think I know, but you don't know the potential for cycling in your city until that infrastructure is there. And whenever a good comprehensive network has been built, people have responded. Climate matters a little, topography matters a little, culture matters a little, but what really matters is infrastructure.
Now, you're probably thinking, what if I need to drive a longer distance? I'd much rather be in my car, podcast playing, aircon on, than sweating into ill-fitting Lycra. Well, consider this. More than half of the daily trips taken by car, rail, or public transport in the US in 2021 were under 3 miles, and half of those were less than a mile.
Biking in the U.S. has this reputation of being an elitist activity. We have what we call the typical bikers, the mammal, the middle-aged male in Lycra. But in fact, the truth is that 38.5% of the people who bike to work in the U.S. come from the poorest 25% of our population. So investments in bike infrastructure are actually benefiting the less wealthy.
This brings us onto the next major goal of the 15-minute city, creating a place that works for everyone, with inclusivity and equity at its core. State spending on subsidies in public transport is a fantastic example of how serious transport policies can create a more equitable city.
The city that I'm looking towards now with the most interest is my hometown of Boston, where we have a progressive mayor, Michelle Wu, who is entirely steeped in planning, thinking, and philosophy. Things are changing here in Boston. For example, one thing that everyone says you could never do is make transit free. Well, guess what? She has selected a few of the most used and most lower income serving bus lines in our city, central to the city, and she's found the money and made those buses free.
Cities are often divided across class, racial, and socioeconomic lines. In fact, 80% of US metropolitan areas have become more segregated over the past 3 decades. And although it's perhaps a more well-known problem in the States, segregation is also on the rise in Europe.
Our cities were segregated, officially zoned by race. And when the Supreme Court said that that was no longer legal, conveniently, the single-family zoning law came along. And Harlan Bartholomew, the famous and not yet discredited American planner who was a big part of that in the early 20th century, stated very plainly that that was the goal of single-family zoning. But if you have a city with single-use zoning, which covers so much of the landscape here in North America, you have a city which is by definition unwalkable.
Essentially, single-use family zoning, which means restricting land to be used and built on by a single family, isn't just terrible for walkability, but is based on an idea of reinforcing segregation. And Jeff wasn't the only person we spoke to who brought up Harlan Bartholomew.
One of the prominent American urban planners who designed probably over 500 cities was Harlan Bartholomew.
That's Taiwo Jaiyeoba. He spent his career across the US putting forward provocative plans that aim to reverse decades of urban planning that cemented inequity.
The growth of these regions presents one of the biggest challenges facing our nation: the problem of urban sprawl.
One is the Urban Renewal Program, or policies of the 1950s that stretched into the 1960s, where the federal government gave cities billions of dollars to tear down blighted areas, replace them with affordable housing. It sounded like good intention, of course, but what happened was it ended up displacing over hundreds of thousands of people, especially people living in Black communities. And those communities have not recovered even till now from that displacement.
Following World War II, cities across the US took part in the Urban Renewal Program. Old multiple occupancy housing was torn down, areas were split up into different zones depending on use, roads were widened for cars, and a minimum requirement of parking spots was introduced. In many cities, whole neighborhoods were razed, and minority populations displaced.
I really believe that if you walk through any major American city today, whether it's in St. Louis or it's in Memphis or it's in Sacramento where I used to work and live, or it's in Charlotte where I was planning director, or here in Greensboro where I'm the city manager, all you need to do is to cross from one neighborhood to the other, and you're going to see that whole impact of redlining, that whole impact of exclusionary city planning that's based on race. Where people of Black, ethnicity or Black race were really marginalized and living in certain areas. It's time for us to definitely be intentional about changing those inequities and correcting the stories.
The stats speak for themselves. According to a Berkeley University study, minorities in highly segregated areas suffer from higher rates of infant mortality, asthma, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. Of course, not all of this can be put down to planning, but consider the amount of food deserts in these areas, the proximity to highways, and the lack of green space, and it becomes apparent that planning is paramount when thinking about inequity. Here's Jeff again, on the very real effects that urban sprawl can have on our health.
The reason why fully a third of the American children born after 2000 are expected to get diabetes is because we have engineered out of existence the useful walk in our society. The lack of useful physical activity that accrues to the automotive society is the dominant force, not only in our obesity epidemic and all the associated epidemics with heart and cancers that come from obesity and diabetes and all of that sort of thing. But it's astounding, not just the degree to which asthma, for example, is a result of living near a highway, but the degree to which that's particularly punitive to people of color and other marginalized populations.
That's where the 15-minute city model laid out by Carlos comes in. Taiwo has taken its principles and applied them to a couple of cities in the state of North Carolina. He's currently the city manager of Greensboro, and before that was director of planning for the city of Charlotte. He was responsible for leading the city's 2040 comprehensive plan. Charlotte, like plenty of other cities in the US, has a racial inequity problem that can be traced across the map.
Charlotte has this thing where you call it the crescent and the wedge. The wedge is South Charlotte, largely. It's the area of mostly white population, or very affluent. South Charlotte was where you have the highest life expectancy. Here you have the best quality of schools, a lot of access to really good parks. And then you look at the crescent, populated mostly by immigrants and people of color. In certain instances, more than 90% of residents were people, were Black people. And it was very interesting because it's also where you have the lowest life expectancy, the poorest quality of schools, if you would, very difficult access to full-service grocery stores or full-service banks, and you could drive stretches and not have, street lights somewhere, and there's no sidewalks.
Charlotte is also in the top 5 fastest-growing cities in the US, and without a comprehensive plan, inequity will go unmanaged and gentrification unchecked.
We talked about 10 different big ideas. One of those was creating 10-minute neighborhoods. Understanding that if you do, then it means you've got to find a way to sync transportation or mobility, multimodal abilities into communities. More than a quarter of the population of Charlotte did not have access to a vehicle. And so how do you provide options for them? Creating a 10-minute neighborhood doesn't mean you have to drive everywhere. It means we've got to bring transit close to you. It means we've got to bring bike trails close to you. It means that we've got to improve sidewalks that will allow you to access some of the places you want to go.
Of course, as we've heard from Jeff and Carlos, transit is a huge piece of the puzzle. But Taiwo also embraces another pillar of the 15-minute city: community participation.
What do people want? What kind of city do they want Charlotte to be? Naturally, people don't trust government. And so we think we come to them only when we need something. I think our engagement has to be proactive. It shouldn't be when I need you to sign off on my plan that I come to you. So when we worked on the Charlotte Future 2040 plan, prior to us even having the plan at all, we went out to the community and we started to ask questions. What kind of future do you want for Charlotte? We had, I believe, about 4 or 5 different engagements, just soliciting input from the community. And then we came back into the office and developed what I call an equity atlas, which was to really map the entire city and talk about the different things we've heard, the dreams and aspirations of our residents, their hopes for the future. What do those things really look like? Land use planning obviously can't solve everything, but a lot of the things that you hear had something to do with land use planning. And so my principle for engagement is that it's got to be proactive. You've got to let the community dream with you.
Back in Paris, Anne Hidalgo and Carlos also want their community to dream with them. They've dedicated 75 million euros to a participatory budget. Since 2014, over 2,000 projects have been implemented as a direct result of citizen co-planning and participation. This functions as a very direct and democratic way where anyone can put forward a project via the website and, with the right amount of votes from residents, the projects are then greenlit and developed. These ideas can include anything from mitigating light pollution to greening urban space. In North Carolina, Taiwo got the community involved in a different way. He set up an anti-displacement committee made up of a group of community members, leaders, and officials to advise and participate in the development of the plan.
Gentrification obviously will ultimately happen, but how can we make sure that we mitigate displacement so that when these things happen, we can actually still keep people in place? One of the recommendations that is actually made is giving people property tax relief, so that if you live in a place, even when you are no longer working, you can stay in that place if they can give you a break on your property tax. You don't have to sell to a developer who is looking to pick up your property. You can still stay in that same place, age in place, and stay in place. I believe that there are so many other ways by which we could actually mitigate displacement. One of the things that I'm doing this year is having a number of round tables with our community, 4 round tables. One of those round tables will be with community leaders. The other roundtables will be with developers. Another roundtable will be with academic institutions, and the 4th roundtable will be with nonprofits. And the whole idea behind it is this: that we are facilitators as government entities of what can happen in a community. As we facilitate those, we need to pull people together and really be able to say, what are the things that we're doing now that we can do better?
It's one thing bringing citizens and residents into the mix to have a say in what happens to their neighbourhood, but how can city officials ensure private entities, like property developers, play ball? After all, the 15-minute city model relies on affordable housing and a wealth of amenities.
It can be challenging, I'll be honest with you, because when developers come to the table, they're working on a funding timeline, and we have to respect that. But the fact of the matter is that for a developer to look at a particular area to develop a particular type of development, it means that it works for them. And they want to come to us as to how can you help me get this through. There's got to be that public-private relationship where we are actually pushing a lot of our private developers to start thinking differently. You're not just thinking that the project that you are developing is a benefit in itself, but what are the implications and the consequences of this project? If I know that as a developer is coming into my community to put up these 400 units of housing, can we work together so that you can also set aside opportunities for us to have a childcare facility there for the community, so the community doesn't necessarily have to move out because you're developing, or having some small businesses like a barber shop. If I know that you're developing something in a Black community and you're taking away this development where we have the barber shop for many years, can you incorporate that barber shop into your new development so that it's still there?
So it's important for Taiwo to work with private developers to ensure new buildings are also beneficial for the community. It's all part of the idea of wanting to create multi-use, high-density areas, providing all necessary amenities close by. For instance, combining services, offices and housing in the same building. Here's Carlos again.
We need to transform not necessarily infrastructures. We need to use more and better the infrastructures that existed today.
The city of Paris has started to repurpose existing buildings to give them multiple uses. Take the case of the Caserne des Minimes, an out-of-use army barracks in the centre of the city that's being retrofitted and repurposed to include offices, apartment blocks, a clinic, and a childcare facility. The city's also using the same principles of reuse to address its housing crisis. It's no secret that the French capital is a notoriously expensive city to buy and rent property in. But Anne Hidalgo aims to have 40% of Paris's housing available for lower-income residents by 2035. The city will create its own real estate firm, buying and repurposing hotels, multi-storey garages, defunct offices, and turning them into social housing. Only time will tell whether Paris will meet this ambitious target, but it's a great example of the public sector being proactive about a housing crisis many of our cities face. Now, beyond the unfounded theories that claim that the 15-minute city is a stepping stone to a surveillance state, there are still some genuine holes in the model, and it wouldn't be right to finish the episode without pointing them out. Firstly, the idea is based on an assumption that modern work isn't tied to location. While it's true that remote work has seen a surge recently, it still only accounts for an average of 13.5% of the labour market in the EU. And in cities with the biggest share of remote workers, they still don't make up the majority. Most people need to travel for work, and creating cities that have this notion of remote work at their core risks segregating people depending on employment. And when it comes to bringing amenities to all, the progress will of course be slow. How do you encourage businesses to move to neighbourhoods where disposable income is low and where crime is high? As Moreno puts it,
the 15-minute city is not a doxa. This is not a copy-paste. 15-minute city is a source of inspiration.
But for now, the model is gaining traction. Moreno's life's work is no longer a research concept, but recognised by the UN, the IPCC and C40 as a blueprint for a successful city. And in the US, Jeff is also cautiously optimistic about progress.
Now, in terms of what I've experienced over 30 years of doing this work, it's been absolutely astounding. It used to be that when we brought these ideas to local governments, they didn't want them, they didn't like them, they didn't understand them, they had no idea what we were talking about, and we had to find those rare communities that had leadership that understood the value of making a more walkable place. Now, almost every city or town of any size in the US, and certainly in much of the rest of the world, understands the value, at least to a degree. They know they want to be more walkable. They know they want to be more bikeable. They understand the value of transit. Everyone wants it.
So what's TOPOSOPHY's take? Firstly, as Carlos Moreno points out, the 15-minute city isn't an instruction manual, but rather a source of inspiration that can help cities address multiple challenges, from improving air quality and mobility to addressing deep-seated inequality and the availability of affordable housing. Essentially, it's a broad approach to correcting years of planning that's resulted in many of the inequalities that we see today. The fact that this rather innocuous concept has recently become tangled up in the culture wars is a reminder that local politics is becoming a contested space, influenced by ideas far beyond our city's borders. And as we've seen, planning and zoning touches on much more than you might think. Issues of identity, race, and inequality all need to be taken into account. All of this underlines the importance of strengthening local democracy and ensuring that, in the words of Taiwo, our engagement must be proactive. City authorities, and particularly those in placemaking and marketing, have a strong role to play in making sure residents' voices are heard when it comes to this kind of decision-making. This is a subject that TOPOSOPHY covered in its most recent report with the City Destinations Alliance, titled Exploring the Role of the Placemaking and Marketing Organisation. The report maps the 10 challenges that cities are likely to face in the coming decade and explains how city authorities can pull expertise to help solve them for the benefit of the environment and local communities. In a globalised world where city centres often start to resemble one another and attract large crowds, it's hardly surprising that neighbourhoods have also become the focus of tourism planning. They seem to offer the authenticity and more gentle pace visitors are looking for. Yet, as investment is made and visitors arrive, the challenge is to preserve exactly this authenticity and to make sure that communities aren't marginalised or displaced in the process. Finally, place analytics, which we'll cover in the upcoming second series of Common Ground, can help identify exactly what local people cherish the most and where they're really spending their time. It's a worthwhile investment that can help inform smart decision-making for local authorities. Thanks for listening to this episode, the final for this season of Common Ground, and thanks to all our guests that have joined us to talk about everything from ageing cities to rural revival and building climate resilience. Stay tuned for Season 2, where we'll continue to speak to the thought leaders, pioneers and experts shaping the future of our cities. I'm Daphne Karnizis, and that was Common Ground by TOPOSOPHY.